Hey everybody, we're live tonight on a Tuesday night, going live with one of my favorite accounts on Instagram. Sharon says so. She should be joining me any moment here. Hold on, let me pin that. She's also been on Instagram over the course of the last year and a half, bringing facts and nonpartisan information. We follow each other. A number of you have found out about my account through her account. And so just at this time, we thought it'd be great to have a conversation. I'll wait for her to join in here. Lisa notes it's the 2 hours before the recall results. They're still voting in California tonight on the recall election. Polls close 8 p.m. in California, 11 p.m. Eastern time. Hold on, let's see if, oh, here we go. Sharon has requested. Still getting the hang of this whole thing. She should be joining me any moment. So yeah, hello.
Hello. Hi.
Wait.
Hold.
Okay.
There's like so much stuff in front of my screen. I can't even see you. Okay, hold on.
No worries at all. I'll let you frame it up.
Okay.
I was just saying we're for those of you on the East Coast that are interested in California election tonight, you'll have to stay up late to potentially get some results, but they count slow at times in California, so it might be a couple days.
How are you this evening?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for inviting me.
It's so great to have you on. I so appreciate you saying yes to the invite.
Yes.
Some folks may know I had the great fortune to tape one of your podcast episodes last week.
That was fun.
It was a lot of fun. And so just as we had the conversation, it was funny. As I was going through the conversation, I was like, well, I really want to know Sharon's take on that. She asked me such good questions. So I have a few of them to throw back at you tonight. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, though I know we have a whole bunch of nerds with us this evening, Sharon McMahon joins us from Minnesota, where she has been a high school government and law teacher for years. And then she took her passion to Instagram. You're just approaching about 700,000 followers now, becoming known as America's government teacher. She's also the host of the Sharon Says So podcast, where she takes you through some of the most fascinating moments in history, including the latest episode about my hometown, Chicago.
And
hometown. And the 1893 World Exposition, which we could just nerd out on that.
Oh my gosh, I love it so much.
So good. And then obviously it's the subject or the backdrop to Devil in the White City, the book that so many people have read. So anyway, so Sharon's been doing all that on Instagram. She does the podcast thing. And she's also leveraged the platform to raise millions for a number of causes. I should note, by the way, at the bottom of your screen tonight, wanted to use this opportunity to raise funds for Team Rubicon, a great organization, veteran-led. They do disaster relief, and they're involved in a whole bunch of stuff right now. Haiti relief, Ida relief, Nicholas that came ashore in Texas yesterday. They're down there. They're also involved in getting Afghan refugees settled here in the U.S. So raising money for them tonight, which is a great cause. But I'd love to start with you, Sharon. Before we get to kind of all the topics and everything you've been doing on Instagram, I'd love to hear your story of, first of all, how you got into teaching. Tell us about your teaching story, and then how you took the kind of teaching to Instagram.
Well, I got into teaching because I had a moment sitting in a class in college where I literally felt like a beam of light descended on me and was like, you are meant to be a teacher, because I really had toyed with the idea of going into medicine or going to law or, something along those lines. And I don't know how to describe it other than just this like knowing of like, this is what you're meant to do. So I changed my major and became a teacher and taught in multiple states, lived out in DC, taught out there for a long time. So Sharon Says So really started about a year ago. I posted my first video about explaining how government worked a year ago. Like a year ago, a couple days ago was the first anniversary.
Happy anniversary. I hope did
Thank
somebody get
you.
you a cake?
And it really, I'd never set out to be like, let me teach you all of these government facts. I just noticed a lot of misinformation about how things like the Electoral College worked. And so I just started posting some nonpartisan, fact-based explainer videos, answering people's questions. Here's how this works. Here's what the Constitution says. Make up your own mind, but here are the facts that you can use to make up your own mind with. And the rest, as they say, is history.
Sharon, the name, how did the name come about?
Friends suggested it. She was just like, like you want to talk about a bunch of different things. And so she suggested, that's how it is. That's very long story.
This, usually the best inspiration comes in conversations like that.
Yep.
So you took it to Insta. You just hit your 1 year anniversary. What have you learned through the process? And what has surprised you in the last year as you took the teaching global, if you will?
So one of the things that has surprised me the most is how hungry people are for education. They don't want to be told what to think. They want to be told, they want to be presented with information so they can make up their own mind about something. They're capable of making up their own mind if they have enough education, but it is really hard to make up an empty mind. So that has been surprising to me, how hungry people are for fact-based information so they can make up their own mind about things. Yeah, I mean, that one of the things that I've learned, I guess, is just the number of people who actually are not interested in being involved in the dumpster fire of conversation surrounding politics, surrounding government that is present all over social media. You know what I'm talking about.
I
Like,
know exactly what you're talking about as somebody who's been in national media for 20 years,
uh-huh,
and you're always reporting on the loudest people in the room, and the loudest
uh-huh,
people in the room tend to be from the extremes.
yep,
And then you quickly learn that there's a lot of people in the middle. In fact, the vast majority of people in the middle who
100%. But that's not newsworthy. You know what I mean? Like if you're having chicken for dinner, that's not newsworthy. It's the people who are eating bike tires for dinner that is newsworthy. You know what I mean? Like it's the people.
there's an old adage in news which is dog bites man is not news, but man bites dog is news.
Yes, that's
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
And so it leads us to believe things about the world that I think are sometimes not always true.
Right, you're like this. There's a huge trend of men biting dogs these days, and it's like, no, we just report on the 5 instances of it because that's what it is.
That's right.
Um, are you balancing right now Instagram and the classroom?
I do not teach in the classroom anymore. I'm trying to adjust my screen. People are like, fix your screen, Sharon. I'm
Yeah,
trying to fix it.
fix your screen. You've also had several questions about your sweater and your makeup this evening as well. I should let you
And I'm
know.
trying to fix it, you guys. Um, Trying to fix it without messing it up. So no, I don't teach in the classroom anymore. I just teach online. I just teach adults, grown-ups, which is a different animal, but I
What
love it.
and looking now at the questions you're getting from adults, from American adults who you would assume have gone through a civics education and a government education in school. What are your observations now about what schools are necessarily where we're lacking in our education, and does there need to be kind of a focus on civics education and government in a way based on the perspective you're getting right now?
Mm. Well, I have been, following this topic for a long time. And I also hear from a lot of people that they have eliminated government classes, eliminated civics classes, or it's a unit in one social studies class in high school, so they're getting now a unit instead of even a whole class. So I think in many ways we are having a little bit of an educational crisis surrounding civics. When you look at the statistics of how much money is spent on civics education, it is tiny. It's like a few cents, 50 cents per student in the United States, something along those lines.
Hmm.
And I feel like it's kind of showing. It's kind of showing
It's
like
translating to our politics potentially,
we're
right?
reaping the fruit of that. We planted the seeds and now we're reaping the fruit of what we decided a while ago.
Um, you know, speaking of you know, by the way, I should say, as somebody who obsessively my favorite class growing up was social studies and
Mm.
government, to the point where my favorite book in elementary school was the World Atlas.
Yes.
So I never quite understood the people who in class would be like, well, I can't stand social
This is
studies.
boring.
This is
How?
boring. Yeah. And there's some of the same people who now, years later, are like, well, can you explain what is going on? And should I be worried about X, Y, or Z happening in Washington
Yeah.
these days? And I should say, just while I, have you, is that several of my most inspirational teachers, I should say, were John Bolger, Dan Larson, Andrew Kinnean. I still remember them very well. They were my high school government teachers, U.S.
Oh.
And comparative government as well as U.S. history, who were extremely inspirational and some of the reasons that I went to school in Washington to then pursue
Mm.
politics and journalism. So,
Mm.
the difference that you make in people's lives, I hope you hear from those folks years later.
I love that. I do hear from some of my students, and some of them message me on Instagram, and it's fun to hear from them again sometimes. And some of them I've kept in touch with over, for a long time. It's really, it's all, teachers always love to hear from their students. If you have somebody and you're like, who is the great teacher? Is Mrs. Smith. She would love to hear from you. That's just like blanket advice for all people. You had a great teacher and they're still alive. Find them and send them a note.
Great advice, and I hope everybody is taking to LinkedIn or Facebook tonight to find their favorite teacher.
Yes.
So when it comes to getting into social media and Instagram news, especially in the last year, it was an election year. It was against the backdrop of COVID. Did you have any sense of what was about to transpire in fall and winter with the disputes, etc.? And I should say, I guess, were you surprised to enter the world you entered into last fall,
Mm.
and engaging in a time where we was an unprecedented election time, but also in the great morass that is social media,
Mm.
and your observations about kind of entering at the time that you did.
Oh my goodness. Well, there certainly was a lot of angst and a lot of questions and a lot of people feeling like, where can I go? Where can I, like, this is very complicated. Where can I find information on this in a way that doesn't make me feel more dumb? You know what I mean? Like, sometimes information is very valuable, but it's at a super high level. And if your understanding is down here, you also don't want to be spoken to like you're a second grader. You just want somebody like, what? Give me the details, give me the facts, just in a super simple way. So I, of course, knew that heading into the election, it was contentious. Of course, we all knew that. Nobody thought that this was going to be a birthday party. I remember doing one radio interview the day before Election Day, and the person on the radio said, how long do you think it will be before we know who the winner is? Will we know tomorrow night? Will it be Wednesday? Like, how long? And I was like, oh, no, 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 no. It will be weeks. And the interviewer was like, what? Like, he was like, that can't be. And I was like, oh, no, no. It'll be 2 to 3 weeks minimum before we have sorted this out. So I definitely knew it was going to be contentious, but I do think the level of contention was difficult to foresee.
I'd love to get a sense from you. We talked about kind of the state of our civics education, how it's translating now to potentially our politics. How would you assess the state of Washington, our politics? How do you communicate that to your students right now in terms of kind of where things are, where things were, and can things get better? What's your take, given the perspective you have of U.S. history, and that, things weren't always, hunky dory.
No. When people are like, oh, well, we should go back to X to, we should go back to the time when things were great. And I'm always like, and what time is that? Like be specific, because it might have been great for your family, but chances are good it wasn't that fantastic for some other groups. Like, what time are you referring to? The 50s? Okay, well, that might have been great if you lived in the suburbs. That might have been great if you were a middle-class white family. It might not have been great if you had a different experience in life. Anyway, however, one of the things people ask me all the time is this the worst it has ever been? Do people ask you that all the time? People are always like, is this the worst it's ever been? Is it nuclear war tomorrow? Like, there's this feeling, this sense of dread, and this sense of like, I don't know if we can ever recover from this. People tell me that all the time.
Well, I'm getting notes lately, like, all right, so when's the Civil War start? I'm like, don't
Yes.
throw around the word Civil War. Like,
no,
please don't.
No. And I'm always, when people say, are we on the brink of civil war? Somebody asked me this yesterday. My first question is always, who is fighting in the Civil War? You know what I mean? Like, our previous Civil War was the government of the United States against people who didn't want to be part of the United States anymore. So who now is fighting the entire weight of the United States military? The biggest and best military in the world. Who is fighting against a 2 million well-trained military, 2 million person well-trained military? Some dudes? You know what I mean? Like, that's not
some dudes.
Not actually a war.
Yeah.
No,
right. It's scary for folks, right? When they see some of this contentious language, and
yes.
So, how do people, or what advice do you give folks to get that balance, or to get that perspective, or to, be able to sleep better at night?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a few things. One is learn history. Keep learning about history. The more you know about history, the more you can see how the arc of history is long, and how actually we have been in much more dire straits than we are right now. You look at like the Great Depression and what people were going through during the Great Depression, when there was absolutely no social safety nets, and if you lost everything, you literally could just die on the street. We have mechanisms to keep things like that from happening today. Learn history. That's part of it. Another thing that I always suggest is that people learn to read their news instead of getting sucked into the pundits that are all over, as you well know.
Especially the pundits that only reinforce your opinions.
Your already held beliefs.
Yeah.
You're like, ooh, gonna tune in to see what old Bob's saying today. I'm just making up names. Like, what's Karen got to say about this? Like, you're looking to them to tell you what you want to hear. And of course, fear is a huge driver of ratings. You don't run to the TV to see what is going on because you really want to see about a picnic that happened at the park. You know what I mean?
I may have worked and been familiar with cable news networks that may have begun every hour with a big bang of breaking news, even when there was none.
Yeah, breaking news. Yeah. Breaking news, the following 42 horrible things could happen tomorrow. Right? There's a lot of speculation about, like, well, here is the worst case scenario. It could be civil war. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So anyway, reading your news, it's like reading a book. There's a difference between watching a horror movie and reading a book. So when you're watching it, your senses are being assaulted and you have to take it in. Whereas when you're reading it, your brain can sort of gloss over things, fill in the gaps, etc. So it seems less overwhelming to you. So reading is, to me, brings more peace and clarity than just sitting and watching endless amounts of punditry.
So we talked a bit about my news diet on your podcast. I'd love to know your news diet. Where are you getting your news from on a daily basis? What are you reading first in the morning? What are you reading last at night? What sources are you turning to?
I, like you, always recommend a variety of sources, and do not just pick one and be like, this source is always correct. You know what I mean? You, on your platform, I love how you talk about verified sources. This is information that is being widely reported by multiple credible organizations. That's a very different position to lead with than just like, here are all the terrible things that could happen. You know what I mean? So I try to read, I have worked my way up to this. And of course, I do this for a job. You do this for a job. This is not something that I am saying everybody else needs to do, but I usually read 7 to 10 news sources a day. And they span the gamut from pretty, ideologically pretty far left, all the way over into the middle and all the way over into the right. So I like to see how various news organizations are reporting on the same story. To me, that's very interesting to see, like, wow, that headline read so much differently than this headline did. And if I only read this one, I would believe something very different about the world than if I read them both.
You actually did a nice job of that today with the story that came out about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley. So Bob Woodward, the famous Washington Post reporter who helped break Watergate, who's now written, I think, a couple dozen books about almost every president,
17 books. Yeah.
and has a knack for getting incredible sources within every administration, has a new book out about the Trump administration, and it includes the story about the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, allegedly, reportedly, based on his sources, calling Chinese generals at least twice to reassure them that everything was going to be okay here in the U.S., but also assure them, allegedly, that he would give them a heads up if for some reason Trump decided to start a war with them. And so explain kind of the various perspectives on how that was covered today.
So you had one side of the spectrum that was like, Mark Milley was so afraid of an unhinged Donald Trump that he was willing to pick up the phone and call China and talk to them about it. And the other side of the perspective is Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, went behind the commander-in-chief's back, did an end run around the person above him and secretly contacted one of our adversaries. Right? So I always talk about, there's the facts of the story, which is that Bob Woodward and Robert Acosta reporting that they did all this research, conducted all these interviews, got all this information, that he made these phone calls. Here's what he said on the phone calls, right? That is what the book says. Those are the facts of the story. That's what the book says. How you choose to interpret that set of facts, that is your bias.
Right.
Yep.
And I will bias. Yeah, go ahead.
People think bias means lie. Bias and lie are not the same. They're not synonyms. They mean something totally different. Go ahead.
No, it's so funny you bring that up because people are always like, Moshe, I like how you're unbiased. I'm like, I am not unbiased. I seek truth. I seek verified facts. I try to provide perspectives, but we all have biases. They're shaped by where we were born, where we went to school, who educated us, our jobs, our friend networks, our social networks, all of that shapes our biases, right? Now you can try your best to try to look beyond your biases to gain all perspectives, but at the end of the day, you're going to see what you see in a unique way versus somebody else, and that in and of itself is your bias, correct?
Well, we all have, your brain creates bias for you based on your own experiences. A bias is a shortcut, right? It's, if you think about, humans 1,000 years ago walking around on the plains, they see a wolf. They don't have to sit and do a 1-hour analysis about whether that animal is dangerous. You know what I mean? They're just like, whoa, get out of here. That is a shortcut that their brain has developed as a bias against that type of animal. So some of our bias, it's important to be aware of them, aware of what our biases are, because we, having prefrontal cortexes in our brains, can choose to override them. And if we're aware of them, we can take steps to circumvent harmful, negative bias that perhaps is not serving ourselves, not serving the world, and is causing us to not see the actual facts in front of us.
So there's your answer, folks. When you're asking for an unbiased news source, None exists. There are news sources that do better jobs than others at providing balance in their stories.
Mhm.
But, in my experience, I'm sure yours, like there are certain publications that you'll turn to and be like, I'm actually surprised about how you guys handled that story. In some
Mhm.
cases, you might have done a really good job. In some cases, you were a little lazy on that story, and it felt like you were, missing a piece of the action there.
Mhm. Some news sources do a better job at restraining their intrinsic bias and in balancing the author's intrinsic bias, against maybe an editor being like, I don't know if you're being fair there. Like, what's the other side to that? Some organizations are better at that than others.
Though you heard a lot, especially in the last couple of years, that maybe there aren't always two sides, Sharon. In some
Mm-hmm.
cases, there's truth, and then there's people who
Mm-hmm.
literally are disagreeing with the fact that the sky is blue or that the earth is round.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you come down there when it comes to the whole discussion as to whether sometimes maybe the other side doesn't have merits to their argument?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely legitimate. I don't think we need to sit here and pretend that there is a positive spin to the way the Taliban treats women. You know what I mean? We're not going to be like, sometimes it's okay if women have no rights. You know what I mean? Like that's not a viewpoint um, worth our time. We're not gonna pretend that like there's a flip side to the positives of Adolf Hitler. You know
Right.
what I mean? Like some things are just wrong and some things are just lies. And there is no there's no room for discussing whether or not something is wrong or a lie, in my opinion. Many things are matters of perspective, but some things are just not.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, just because I've been getting questions about them, and I think you've done a bit of a dive into it, is related to the vaccine mandate and the legalities of that.
Mhm.
And vaccine mandates or vaccines have a long history in this country. You can go back to Abigail Adams and George Washington,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
there have been cases. And want to give folks perspective. The president made this announcement. We're waiting on the Department of Labor to then make a rule about it. Then we're waiting for inevitable lawsuits.
Mhm.
Where do vaccine mandates stand in American history, and what should people be on the lookout for as the months and potentially years related to this progress?
Mhm. Well, I mean, as you mentioned, vaccine mandates have been around since America's inception. George Washington, of course, mandating smallpox vaccination for just the military. But we have Supreme Court cases dating back to the early 1900s. And those cases have really resurfaced in the last 2 years. When one of them is Jacobson versus Massachusetts, when John Roberts, who is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, cited Jacobson v. Mass as a precedent in one of his opinions. So when you bring that up as like, in the past, here's what we've decided, I'm going to use the same rationale, that demonstrates on some level a commitment to that precedent. You don't bring that up again if you don't think that that's a worthwhile or legitimate precedent to bring up. Now, people are free to disagree with the court's interpretation on that. That's purely a matter of perspective. But that is the sort of the legal basis that the court has been, that precedent that they've been resting on for a long time. And so if people are not familiar with that case, in a nutshell, it was about a community in Massachusetts that wanted to mandate smallpox vaccination. And when we say mandate, it does not mean that they were going to hold people down and forcibly vaccinate them. It was pay a fine. The fine was $5, which is roughly the equivalent of $150 today. And a gentleman who was a Swedish immigrant did not want to get the vaccination. He felt he had had a bad experience with being vaccinated back in his home country in the past, and he didn't want it. And the government sought to impose a $5 fine on him. And he fought that case for multiple years, all the way up to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court ultimately decided against him and said that governments do have the right to balance the needs of the community against the rights of the individual. And that there is, as long as, again, um, when you read the opinion, you can see how they are somewhat restrained in their balance test, that it needs to be a reasonable balance is what they said. So they need to be taking reasonable precautions for public health. That's what the Supreme Court opinion said in 1905.
Got
Not
it. So,
just,
and that, of course, was a state case. And I guess one of the questions we
Mhm.
have here is whether the idea that this is a federal mandate could
Mhm.
could make this potential case different than
Mhm.
that case being a state case, given that
Mhm.
we have a federal government here,
Yeah.
federal system.
Oh, it absolutely will. It
Yeah.
100% will. Not just because it's the federal government versus the state government, but because the methodology of the rulemaking will be at issue. Whether or not an executive order directing a federal regulatory agency to make a rule that applies to only certain employers, that is going to be the subject of lawsuits, undoubtedly. The state of Arizona filed a lawsuit against the Biden administration today, saying, invoking the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, saying that the fact that undocumented immigrants crossing the southern border were not being subjected to vaccination gave them preferential treatment. And the lawsuit alleges that cannot preferentially treat undocumented immigrants over United States citizens working at large businesses. So there are going to be, people always think it's going to be a discussion about the larger issue of, is it okay if we have vaccine mandates? When in reality, the Supreme Court generally decides very, very narrow, tiny little things about, does it violate the Equal Protection Clause? Can OSHA actually do this only for businesses over 100 people? It's going to be these very, very narrowly tailored decisions if the Supreme Court takes it up.
That actually brings me to the next topic, and it's almost the perfect point there, because the Texas abortion law was a
Mm-hmm.
very narrowly written law in a unique way. And it wasn't this most recent Supreme Court decision, if you can call it a decision, it was a decision not to
Mm-hmm.
block the law. Explain what happened there, because again, in the way that Texas approached abortion, didn't lead the Supreme Court to just rule abortion good, bad, legal, not
That's
legal.
right. That's right. And the Supreme Court rarely does that. We, like, exactly like you're saying, we want them to paint with these big broad strokes of like abortion bad or abortion rights yay. Like we want them to make those kind of grand pronouncements. And in reality, the vast majority of the time, they're making very, very minute, narrow decisions. So of course, Texas invented a new type of law enforcement, which is to allow private citizens to enforce the law for them by filing lawsuits against providers and people who might be assisting in abortion procedures past a certain point in the pregnancy when fetal cardiac activity can be detected. And people sought an emergency injunction. And that injunction, of course, being like, stop the implementation of this law, please. And the Supreme Court declined to issue that emergency injunction. And they very specifically said in that 12-page opinion that this was not a decision on the merits. Like every justice who wrote either a dissent or wrote part of the majority, which we don't know who wrote the majority, although I have my guesses, specifically said, this is not a decision on the merits. This is just about whether or not the standard was met to issue an emergency injunction, and it wasn't.
And so what next with that? You told that radio host on election day or day before election, this is going to be weeks. On both the issues we just talked about, one, the vaccine mandate, and two, the Texas abortion law. What's our time frame here, do you think, before people will get a sense of the final ruling of the final word, if you will, on each of those?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, so I mean, this is obviously a bit speculative, but
I'm putting you on the spot. Sharon. I apologize.
Given the some extraordinary resistance and the controversy to both of these subjects, this is not one of those things where it's like 5 years down the road, people might file a lawsuit if they think about it hard enough. Like we're already filing lawsuits immediately. They're already in process. More are coming. Texas also today was like, we will definitely be filing a lawsuit. Other states will as well. So in terms of COVID mandates, like vaccination mandates, the Supreme Court has really sort of throughout the past year and a half stepped up their timelines. Anything related to COVID, they have decided relatively quickly. They decided multiple cases in the 2020 session very quickly. They did not go through the normal lengthy process. So, and some of that is because of the things like some of the constitutional rights that they felt were at issue. So this may not be the same warp speed, so to speak, because we're not dealing with the freedom of religion issue like we were with some of the other cases. But I do think that it will probably be sometime in the next year. And I know people are like, a year? That is too long.
Which booster will we be on at that point? Yeah.
A year is a long time. Yeah. And I mean, there are going to be so many different lawsuits attacking various angles of both of these issues that it's going to take a long time to fully sort them
out. One thing we hope doesn't take that long is the state of California in figuring out its next governor.
Counting their ballots.
Counting their ballots, though. As a New Yorker, it actually turns out, by the way, while Nevada got a bum rap during the election, the state that took the longest to count its votes was here, New York State, the Empire State. Just before, what was it, the second week of December, when they had to have everything in. So anyway, California's having a recall election. There's a whole discussion, and there's some states that have this recall law, and there's folks out there who say, in some cases, we might have too much democracy in this country. Talk a bit about that. California, with all these referenda, they give power to the people to vote on all these things. In other states, you need the state legislature to vote on those things. In California, they've given the average voter that power, which sounds good to some folks. In practice, has its issues. Talk about this whole idea of too much democracy, not enough democracy, the kind of spectrum of democracy.
I was just talking to somebody about this earlier today. Like, California has more direct democracy than almost any state in the union, and certainly more than most democratic nations in the world. And direct democracy, of course, is just allowing the citizens to vote on things. And California allows many things to be put on the ballot. Should we pass this proposition, and this proposition will lower emissions in new cars sold after blah, 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 like the minutia of what can be put on the ballot in California is unparalleled. And that is both a good and a bad thing. Too much direct democracy is very expensive and inefficient. It takes a very long time to get tens of millions of people to vote on something and then to count the ballots. And it is tremendously expensive. This recall election, for example, costing hundreds of millions of dollars, and that taxpayers pay for that. So that has to be balanced against representative democracy, in which you're voting for people to represent you. So there are definitely positives to direct democracy in that you feel empowered as a citizen, that you personally get to cast your educated vote, right? Like, that is you feel like, I am voting no, whatever it is you want to vote no on. And you feel more empowered, especially if you dislike the person that was elected to represent you. If you don't like your representative, you probably like more direct democracy. But that is also has to be balanced against the fact that many people who are voting do not take the time to educate themselves. They're still allowed to vote. That's still how democracy works. But sometimes you may have things that get passed or things that get shut down that actually would have been fantastic if you had a group of people whose job it was to try to balance all of these competing interests against one another instead of just their own self-interest.
A great explanation of that. I see some of the comments here. There's people in Nevada who are like, yeah, we're dealing with the ramifications of all these Californians unhappy with their state coming this way, too much democracy. And I think people, might be surprised, or they might recall from their U.S. history classes, that there was a time where the U.S. Senate wasn't elected directly.
Nope.
By the average voter.
Nope, elected by the state legislatures. And that did not change until the turn of the 20th century.
Like, and now you take for granted that you get to vote for your U.S. senator. But, for the first 20 years of this country, you couldn't do that. So
That's right.
there's a balance there, definitely. When it comes to government involvement in things and too much democracy, it goes the other direction too. And I'd love to get your perspective as an educator when it comes to this whole debate now about critical race theory and the government getting involved and what can be taught in the classroom, and how detailed. And I know there's been some pushback from teachers who are concerned that, that they're scared to teach certain things now because they don't know where the law stands. They don't want to deal with, potentially teaching something illegal, right? Depending. First of all, how did we get here? And what do you make about this whole debate when it comes to this idea of teaching critical race theory in classrooms?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of how we got here is thanks to cable news and social media. There has been a lot of fear being installed in people about this topic. People do not want to send their children to school where they feel like they're going to be indoctrinated with fake stuff, right? Like that. I'm like, I don't want that. That sounds terrible. I don't want my children to be taught that. And so when people have been led to believe that this is what is being taught in their second grade classrooms, of course you feel afraid of that. Of course you feel incensed about that. In reality, I've never seen a public school curriculum that has critical race theory in it. I'm not saying 0% do. I'm not saying it has never happened in the history of the United States. Critical race theory is a law school class. It's taught at a very, very high academic level, and it is not meant for first graders. It is a very kind of nebulous framework of looking at the law and the ways in which things like race have influenced the law, the legal system, the justice system in the United States. And so I think there has been a conflation of critical race theory and just talking about race in general, right? Like any conversation about race,
They're painting with that brush that everything about race is just critical. That's critical race theory.
Yeah, that's right. If we bring up the fact that white people did something bad, or anything that is unflattering about any particular group, particularly white people, is critical race theory. That is that broad brush that we have painted these things with. When in reality, I don't know that the media, individuals, have done a good job of explaining exactly what critical race theory is.
Well, I have to tell you, as a member of the media, that we don't explain nuance well, and shades of gray well. We're like, well, I guess we're talking about this. There's black and there's white, and there's right and there's wrong, and there's up and there's down. And, now with online journalism, you can have unlimited words potentially, but for the most part, in newspapers, you have limited word count. On TV, you have limited minute count before the commercial break. And you have 1:45 to explain a very complex situation. I mean, I was at Evening News and I was like, oh, the war in Gaza started. This was a different war in Gaza. And I was like, you have 1:10 to do the latest, thing
the
in
entire history.
Explain the Middle East in 1:10 in 70
right.
seconds. Yeah.
Please distill thousands of years of history down to 82 seconds. Thank you.
Yes, I know, and it's an unfortunate reality, and some people do a better job than others, but you can't, you can never be comprehensive, and you try your best. So where do we go from here, and how do we do? I mean, you're doing your small part, right? You're doing your Instagram account, you're doing your podcast. I'm trying my best out here as well.
Yeah.
How can folks who are watching help contribute to ensuring that less people receive misinformation? Wave your wand, Sharon.
I have a few tips and I'll fix it. A few tips. One is you have to understand that you are accountable. You are accountable for what you post online and what you repost online. The standard is not, I agree with it, so it's true. Likewise, the standard is also not, I disagree with it, so it's a lie. Your allegiance should be to facts and the truth. Your allegiance should not be, in my perspective, your allegiance should not be to a politician or to a political party. Your allegiance should be to facts and the truth. And I know you and I have had this conversation too. Like, it actually, if somebody that I voted for did something bad, I don't like it that they did something bad, and I am willing to call them on it because my allegiance is to the facts and my allegiance is not to one person or one party. So taking your own personal accountability for, if I am unwilling or unable to verify the information contained on this graph that I want to repost, if I don't have time or the inclination to go back to the primary source, then don't repost it, because misinformation is a threat to democracy. And you might not have bad intentions, but those, nebulous, those just like real low-key intentions might actually have a very deleterious effect to somebody else who takes actions based on the misinformation that perhaps you reposted. So taking accountability, being willing to look for the original primary sources of the information that you are going to repost. And if you are unwilling or unable to do that, then just don't repost it.
It kills me with these videos that I sometimes get sent. Like, do you see this video? I was like, well, who's in the video? I don't know, but they're making good points. I'm like, well.
I get sent so many videos that are like 25 minutes long, and they're like, can you fact check this? People want me to watch the 25-minute video. I'm like, what is in it? Tell me what this is about.
When was this from? Who
right.
is in it?
What is happening? I don't have 25 minutes to devote to this lie.
Right. No, I try to explain to people, and like I try to do it in as polite way possible. It's like, you can Google this. You have the power to Google this story that you heard from your friend. I wanted to get to, because I'm just curious also as kind of a history nerd myself, and as somebody who has studied all this stuff. So I've come a speed round for you, to the extent that we can do a speed round. Like, what is your favorite period of American history?
I always default to loving the Revolution. It's fascinating to me. America's origin story is still so incredibly, it's in our DNA. It's who we are as a people. And so without understanding the origin story, you can basically understand nothing else.
If I'm looking to learn that origin story and I have a certain amount of time on my hands, what is there a specific book, articles, places that you would suggest folks turn to?
I love the writings of David McCulloch and Doris Kearns Goodwin. Like their writings on, if you read a biography, for example, of John Adams, or you read a Ron Chernow biography of Alexander Hamilton, those things are long, clearly. But you can't understand the character without understanding the history of where they are in time. So you will, rather than reading a book of like the history of the United States, which is,
there's actually a couple books that I think have that title, like
the history of the United States. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but those can read a little bit more like a textbook versus these kind of biographies that give you so much information, not just about the person, but also about what was happening at the time.
I was struck recently by one of your recent podcasts. You took a question from somebody who was talking about their favorite president as Thomas Jefferson. And but then they were reading into Thomas Jefferson and they found out, well, wow, this guy might have written, the Declaration of Independence and contributed to all these things, but he has a really problematic personal background. And and it's a discussion we're still having to today as we find out things even about people who are living today who are like, wait, what did I learn about them? Well, I enjoyed what they did in entertainment or whatever, or in politics, but like, what were they doing behind the scenes? And so how do you suggest to folks to kind of balance the people who have made positive contributions with those who have but also have problematic personal stories? And most of the founders fall in that
Do.
category. Yeah.
Most of them do.
Yeah.
And we're not just talking about slavery. There were many other things that today we'd be like, I don't approve, by today's standards. So to me, there is no perfect way to do this. This is not like, ooh, I have cracked the code and you have to do it like me. But the way that I sort of reconcile these things is I try to look at a person's life on balance. I try to look at whether or not they could have possibly known how problematic their behavior was. And I try to look at their positive contributions balanced against their negative contributions. And I also strongly believe in calling a spade a spade. We can say, wow, that Declaration of Independence, nice work on that. That was a great Dear John letter. Like, we are breaking up with you. You're terrible. Here's all the reasons why. We can look at that document now and be like, wow, nice work. We can also simultaneously be like, wow, Sally Hemings, that was not okay. Like your wife's half-sister.
So sorry, we're talking about Thomas Jefferson here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings being his wife's half-sister, who was a woman he enslaved that he, fathered children with, etc. We can look at both of those things and call a spade a spade. We don't need to deify the founding fathers because they were human men who made very poor choices in some cases and had amazing contributions in other cases.
Yeah.
Did Thomas Jefferson know slavery was wrong? Yes, he absolutely did. His writings it's well documented that he really wrestled with it. And he had moral misgivings about it and continued to do it anyway. So we're not just talking about the evolution of women's roles in society over time. Like, you can understand a little bit more about, like, John Adams had a different view of women's contributions to society. That has changed dramatically in society over time. But some things people absolutely knew were wrong and they did them anyway.
So that gets me to, so we've focused in on your favorite period of history. American history is the Revolutionary War. This might be really difficult for you, but I'll ask it anyway. Favorite president that we don't typically hear about?
Favorite president we don't typically hear about. So you're saying not George Washington and Abraham Lincoln?
Yeah. They can't have a monument that we know that's a very popular national monument in their name.
I have to go with Taft. People know who he is, but I'm not even saying that I absolutely love all the decisions he made. But one of the things that I find very interesting about him, of course, he's famous for being the largest president. And
right, that's what most people know about him. Didn't they have to change the bathtub for him? Right.
Yeah, bathtub. Didn't he
Yes.
weigh 400 pounds? Yeah, that's what people remember about it. James Madison was the tiniest president. He weighed like 110, 115 pounds, and he was 5'4". That's neither here nor there. One of the things I find interesting about Taft, however, is that after leaving the presidency, he became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was a constitutional law scholar at a university. So to me, that is a person who is, rooted in the Constitution of the United States. He obviously had a love for it in a similar way that I do. And so even though there's no president with whom I agree with every decision, I just think that's an interesting thing about him. And I enjoy that about Taft.
Which historical world leader fascinates you the most?
Oh, goodness. I have always been fascinated by the czars of Russia. I've always loved, like, Tsar Nicholas II, not because I think they're great people, but because I'm like, what? They shot them in a room in a house and the bullets ricocheted off their jewels. You know what I mean? Like, that kind of stuff is very interesting to me. But I'm also very interested in Margaret Thatcher. She is just like what an interesting character in history Margaret Thatcher was.
Do you watch The Crown?
Of course.
How do you feel about her portrayal? I'm totally zoning on her name, from X-Files, who portrayed Margaret Thatcher.
Jillian, what's her face?
Yeah.
Jillian.
Yeah.
Yes, Jillian. So I just got into the season that she is in, and
Gillian Anderson.
Gillian Anderson. Yes. I am liking it. The first episode, I was like, okay, I'm going to have to learn to suspend my disbelief that this is Gillian Anderson. But she has actually, I feel like, I don't know, I feel like she's working hard to adopt her mannerisms. What has been your impression?
Listen. I think that it's really I've always been fascinated by that kind of end of the Cold War period
Yes.
because you kind of think about the personalities. You had Gorbachev, you had Reagan, you had
Yep.
Thatcher. These folks who to this day and maybe at the time seemed kind of larger than life.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a handful of personalities who were bringing it sort of this 50-year era to an
Yeah.
end through those 80s. So I love watching The Crown. I mean, I think that last season was a little slower
Yeah.
than others, but getting the Diana Charles story is fascinating. But
Yes.
where they bring in and intertwine British history with The Crown, I'm constantly Googling like, okay, did they just conflate three things? Did that happen after that happened? Like,
Right.
and I think they do a really interesting job of it. It's hard having friends who are script writers and work on that side of the business, to try to stay true to history, but also bring drama and have it kind of fit nicely into 10 or 12 episodes
Right.
is a challenge.
Absolutely. Otherwise, it's just a documentary. So
Correct.
you have to fictionalize some of it. You have to create that dramatic tension. Otherwise, it's a documentary, which has its place, but is a totally different kettle of fish.
So you asked me on the podcast, what if I could write any amendment to the Constitution,
Mhm.
what I would write, and I talked about making Election Day a holiday so everybody could vote.
Mhm.
I'm going to throw the question back at you.
What amendment would I write? Well, I
Yeah.
mean, okay, I do think we need to pass the Equal Rights Amendment. I think women need to have guaranteed in the Constitution equal rights. That's just a no-brainer in my mind.
What?
But
How would that change? Um, like, first of all, we were very close to it, right? We were only a couple states
mhm,
away from it
mhm,
happening.
mhm.
Um, how would it have changed things? I ask you to prognosticate, but also if today the ERA was passed and enshrined in the Constitution, how would that change things on a day-to-day
Mm,
basis?
mhm. I don't know that it actually would change a lot of things. I don't know that our day-to-day life would be like, wow, now I have rights. You know what I mean? Because we have interpreted so many of our existing constitutional amendments to apply to all citizens, regardless of their sex. So I don't know that it would change a lot, but it absolutely would say to all of the women and girls that they are just as meaningful as the people who wrote the Constitution, which were men, that they deserve a place in history, that they deserve a seat at the table. To me, it's more symbolic than a practical day-to-day change. Um, of course, the Equal Rights Amendment has already been written, so that just needs to be ratified. You know what I mean? So if I were going to invent a new if I were going to invent a new constitutional amendment, without a doubt, it would radically change the way campaigns are financed in the United States. Get all of this dark money out of here. Like,
Well, there
let's.
was a Supreme. What was the most recent Supreme Court case that one? What was it? 2001, 2002. That
Mhm.
a lot that
Citizens
based.
United.
Yes,
Hmm.
the Citizens United case. I mean, I remember
Hmm.
I was covering the McCain campaign in 2007, 2008 for Fox, and John McCain would rail
Yes.
against it.
He was, because of course, Citizens United was a decision surrounding the McCain-Feingold Act, which was a campaign finance act that changed the way campaigns were financed. And it was, this big bipartisan thing. Russ Feingold, a Democratic senator, John McCain, a Republican senator, and they worked together to be like, this amount of money in our election system is not benefiting the American public. Money is a corrupting force. It just is. It doesn't mean everybody that has a lot of money is corrupt. It just means that you cannot deny the overwhelmingly, the evidence that shows that money can control things in ways that are sometimes not beneficial. So if you changed the Constitution, then we'd be able to get rid of Citizens United because it wouldn't just be based on the existing Constitution. We would have a new amendment to the Constitution, and they would have to accept that it's constitutional to restrict the amount of money in elections.
Right. If somebody brought a case against it, the Supreme Court would have to say, well, according to the new amendment.
That's right. Now it's constitutional.
Now it's constitutional. You know, it's always amazing, you know, when I get questions from Europeans, and I imagine you have a number of international followers as well, who are just shocked by it. And I don't know if you know any examples top of head, but I kind of assume now that you have all the stuff memorized. But just any countries, I know they're going through an election right now in Canada, but typically these parliamentary systems, how long do those elections last and how are they funded? Just for perspective for Americans who are used to our crazy system.
Yeah. In parliamentary democracies like Canada, Australia, etc., the election season is 6 to 12 weeks long.
12
like
weeks, everybody. Weeks.
6 to 12 weeks long. In Australia, it's like 6 weeks. And let me tell you, we are about to, next year, we're about to kick off the 2024 presidential election campaign. After the midterm elections of 22, we're going to get started on 24. And it is going to, that obviously is going to be contentious again. But the idea that we would spend 2 years having campaigns is, the American public is weary. It's weary of the amount of advertisements. It's weary of the amount of the length. Like, I could handle 6 weeks of yelling. I can't handle 2 years of yelling. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
My husband has a PhD in political science. I obviously do this for a living. We're both very interested in this topic. And we had the conversation last year before the election, how weary we were of talking about this. And my husband was like, if you and I are weary, think about how the average citizen who doesn't do this for a living, who doesn't passionately care about this on a daily basis, they were done a year ago. So I don't think it gives us a better democracy to have this process last for years. Somebody's like weary AF. Somebody like
that's what everyone is saying. You know, it's so interesting because you go into it and people are like, we were talking about back in January, like, okay, Biden's taken over, there's new Congress, etc. I was like, he has 9 months. And I'm like, what do you mean he has 9 months? He has 4 years. I was like, no. He has 9 months, and then the midterm cycle kicks off, and nobody's going to get anything done next year. And then the presidential cycle kicks off, and then no one else gets done. So the new president, FDR kind of famously had his 100 days. The new president really, this year is their year to get stuff done. And then it becomes very complicated because everyone's distracted by running again.
That's right. Yeah, you're not wrong. So that would be my amendment, is changing the way campaigns are run and financed in the United States.
Well, by the way, is anyone talking about that in a serious way? And, where do the parties kind of stand on that these days? Where, on the, on the road to that, where are we?
Well, there was a push to pass the For the People Act, which would radically have changed how campaigns were financed. And one of the interesting things about the For the People Act, which failed in the Senate, moved forward in the House, was if you took out the idea of here's who introduced it. Here is, this is an idea put forth by this party. And you sat people down, and this was, again, some polls that were done. And you said, how do you feel about this, and this? Overwhelmingly, over 80% of Americans were like, I like it. Pass that law. People on both sides of the spectrum want money out of politics in the way that they do. People don't want billionaires to be able to buy elections in the United States. So that, again, failed in the Senate because there weren't enough votes to get it out of the filibuster process. But people are talking about it. The For the People Act was a genuine attempt to change how campaigns were financed very recently.
I look back at that last election cycle, and I guess some people did see positive news out of the fact that Mike Bloomberg and Tom Steyer, both billionaires who ran, I think Mike might have spent $1 billion over 100 days.
Yep,
weren't successful in translating their
right.
own money to election.
Yep.
And
You still have to have the right candidate.
yeah.
You know what I mean? It can't just be like, hey, I'm Adolf Hitler and I have $1 billion. Please elect me. That's not going to fly. You still have to have the right candidate. But the amount of money that is funneled into political action committees to elect the right candidate, it's a little disturbing, in my opinion.
By the way, just below, I don't know if you missed it in the comments, but several folks are nominating you to be a presidential debate moderator. Um,
I'm into it. That's my dream job.
and
I'm going to
somebody
do it.
says they want you to co-host it with Andy Cohen.
Andy Cohen would be like, tell me what you're wearing.
Well, I was going to say, like, the Andy Cohen Anderson Cooper combo on like New Year's Eve on CNN is a fairly entertaining combo. So, why not? Why not try to see if there's magic there with you and him? Those are the people who, by the way, aren't calling for you to run for president. Do you have any ambition, Sharon, to run for political office?
Oh, God, no. Absolutely not. No, I'm zero interest in running for political office. That is a lot of boring meetings with people I don't like.
Well, the problem I have is that I just feel like, I watch these congressional hearings and I'm like, oh, we need better people in our government.
Yeah,
But then good people like you
I
don't
know.
want to be involved in government. So what's their solution there? I don't know. Have you thought about that?
Yes, the solution is getting money out of politics, because if we are able to do that, then we don't need a candidate who can raise $1 billion. You know what I mean? Then we don't have a 2-year election cycle in which all of the media has 2 years to talk to your second grade teacher about some shoes that you wore that were the wrong color one day on school picture day. You know what I mean?
Highly controversial. Scandalous elementary school back.
That's right. Scandalous. If we changed the system, we might have people more interested in participating. Right now, the system is so, for lack of a better term, is so jacked up that it makes good people want to turn away from participating in the system, because they just are like, I'm not into that. I'm not interested in subjecting myself to that.
And their families, right? People know that now you run for office, your family will be dragged through the mud.
Absolutely. Like, if I have teenage children too, that I'm like, oh dear, absolutely not. I would not subject my teenage children to that. When you look at what the Bush twins, Chelsea Clinton, et cetera, went through, it was, traumatic. Would you ever run for office?
Would I? It's so interesting. I was actually, because it was the 20th anniversary of 9/11, was recalling that was actually the first day of my internship on Capitol Hill for my home state senator, Senator Durbin, who happens to still be there. And we evacuated the Capitol that day, and I spent that semester. So that was the fall semester of 2001 on Capitol Hill, as Congress kind of dealt with the fallout, the launch of the global war on terrorism, Iraq already, the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And it was so interesting because at a time where everyone was preaching unity, I already saw just kind of how people were trying to utilize even the weeks and months after 9/11 to their party's political advantage. And it really made me disenchanted by the process. And so at the same time, I was always interested in journalism and was like, I'd rather call balls and strikes and call out both sides than pick a team. And, at the same time, I also know from my experience in the media what it means, the type of scrutiny you're going to face, and now to the point where it's like, anything you did ever, to your point, first grade teacher says, oh, he did something weird in my class in 1989. Okay, so what does that mean? Like,
That's right. He pulled the girl's hair, and that shows that he's a predator. Yes.
By the way, to my recollection, I did not pull a girl's hair, for the record, but yes.
No, not you. Of course not you.
So somebody might be confused. They're like, oh, I thought Moshe was the one who did that. And then the headline's written a certain way, and then that's it. It's all over. But no, I shorthand, I'm trying my best through, doing what I'm doing to try to help this democracy to the extent that I can in one small way. So.
Did you ever visit the Capitol Hill row house shared by Dick Durbin and Chuck Schumer?
I never got to enter it, but I was outside of it. For those who don't know, there's congressmen and senators who often, they make an okay salary, but they need to keep their home in their home state or
Yeah.
district, and also need to have a home in Washington. Some sleep in their office, some for no good reason, some for financial reasons. And then you have there was a short run series on Amazon based
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
the Schumer, and it was John Goodman, I believe, starred in it.
Yep. Yep.
Alpha House.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So the senator, they kind of live together. Apparently, one was, I forget which one is the one who kind of is the messy one, but one was very messy and left his stuff everywhere. I think Schumer and Durbin would point fingers at each other on that. But
Yes.
they actually brought people on 9/11. Some of the staff who didn't have anywhere to go that day or couldn't go home that day, back to that house that day. I went back to campus. I was at GW at the time. So.
You can find a piece on YouTube that was done by CNN where the senators bring them in and give them a tour, and they're literally like sleeping on a bed in the living room. And they're like, this has been here, this piece of paper's been here since 1981. I mean, it is just like, you live here? What?
It's a total frat house.
It really is.
Yeah. And you're like, you guys are approaching 70 years
like
old.
70 years old men. Yes, I have heard that Chuck Schumer now has a condo.
Major upgrade.
Big upgrade. Yeah.
For that senator. I don't want to take up any more of your time, Sharon, but I appreciate you joining me. I hope this conversation was helpful to folks.
Yes.
And it's always great talking to somebody who's, trying to be a voice of light and facts in this kind of mess. Actually, that was going to be my last question to you, was just kind of like, social media, good or bad? Instagram, good or bad, Sharon, when it comes to our larger goal here?
It's a tool. It's just like airplanes. On 9/11, they were weapons. At other times, they rescue people from a fate worse than death. So it's a tool, just like an airplane is a tool. It can be used for tremendous good. And I've worked to try to harness some of its power for good, as have you. And it can also be a tool of tremendous destruction.
Good summary, but I'm going to end on a positive note because I see bottom of the screen we've raised about $650 for our friends at Team Rubicon.
Very nice.
So hopefully, hopefully that can be used to continue to help their disaster relief and the veterans who leave war and want to continue to contribute to this nation. So thanks to all of you who contribute to that, and thanks to you, Sharon, and we'll
do this again.
Keep it going. We'll do it again.
Yes.
And I taped your podcast, so we'll one of your editions of the podcast will be coming out soon, where we talk more about all of this. Wonderful.
Yep. All right. Have a good night.
Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.
All right. Bye.